The air in the ravine was cold, clinging to his skin with a dampness that felt ancient and deep. 10-year-old Ethan knelt in the rich, dark soil, the kind his father had called black gold, feeling its cool texture between his small, dirt-caked fingers. His 3-year-old sister, Claire, was asleep a few feet away, wrapped in a threadbare blanket under a crude shelter of branches. For days, this place had been a tomb, a vertical grave gifted to them by a cruel man. But in that moment, as his eyes adjusted to the perpetual twilight at the bottom of the canyon, he saw it. Clustered on a fallen, moss-covered log was a bloom of wild shiitake mushrooms, their brown caps glistening faintly in the filtered light. He recognized them instantly from the farmer's market, a place of distant, happier memories. A breath he didn't know he was holding escaped his lungs, and for the first time since his father died, a feeling that was not fear, not hunger, but a fragile electric flicker of possibility coursed through him. This place was not an end. It was an incubator. This single moment of clarity would change everything for him and his little sister, a testament to how hope can be found in the most discarded places. If you believe in the power of human resilience, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life, so be sure to like this telling and subscribe to the channel. Trust me when I say you will want to hear how this young boy, armed with nothing but his father's memory and a handful of seeds, turned a place of exile into a garden of hope. This is a story about how the things one person throws away in cruelty, another can cultivate into a source of life and defiance. It's a journey worth seeing through to the very end, a reminder that the greatest strength often grows from the deepest wounds, nurtured in silence and shadow until it is ready for the light. But to understand how a 10-year-old boy came to be alone with his baby sister at the bottom of a treacherous ravine, and to grasp why the sight of a simple fungus felt like a profound salvation, we must go back 48 agonizing hours. We must return to the oppressive heat of the Blackwell tobacco farms, to a small, dilapidated workers' cabin where the world was about to shatter. It all began not with a dramatic act of malice, but with a quiet, final exhaustion. It began the moment William Carter's heart, strained by years of relentless labor from dawn until dusk, finally gave out after a 15-hour shift under the blistering North Carolina sun, leaving his 2 children utterly and completely alone. Their journey into the dark did not start in the ravine. It started there in the sudden, terrifying silence that followed a good man's last breath. For 7 years, the world of 10-year-old Ethan Carter was defined by the scent of curing tobacco and the fine red dust of the North Carolina soil. His existence was circumscribed by the endless green rows of the Blackwell tobacco farms, a sprawling empire of labor built in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This was not a home in the traditional sense, but a holding pen, a place of perpetual motion where the sun was both a source of life for the crops and a relentless overseer for the men who tended them. Ethan's days were a rhythm of waiting, of watching his father, William, disappear into the pre-dawn mist and reappear long after the sun had bled out behind the western peaks. A ghost made of exhaustion and dirt. Life was a cycle of absence and brief, weary presence, a reality Ethan had learned to accept with the quiet resignation of a child who has never known anything different. His father, William Carter, was a man carved from the very earth he worked. At only 38 years old, his face was a roadmap of hardship, etched with lines of fatigue that seemed too deep for his age. His hands were calloused and permanently stained, but they were the same hands that would gently check on a sleeping Claire in the middle of the night, or carefully portion out their meager dinner to ensure his children ate first. After Ethan's mother was lost to the complications of childbirth 3 years earlier, something in William had calcified into pure, unyielding determination. He took on the longest shifts, the most grueling tasks, driven by the singular, desperate need to keep his 2 children fed and sheltered in a system designed to grind men like him into dust, a system that offered no mercy and recognized no humanity beyond the value of one's labor. The cabin they called home was little more than a shack, one of dozens lining a dirt road on the far edge of the Blackwell property. It was a flimsy structure of unpainted wood, drafty in the winter and suffocating in the summer, with a floor that creaked under every step and a roof that wept during heavy rains. Yet within its four walls, William had cultivated a sanctuary. It smelled of boiled potatoes, cheap soap, and the faint, sweet scent of the wildflower bouquets Ethan would pick for the small jar on their makeshift table. It was a space defined not by what it lacked, but by the fierce, protective love that filled its every corner. This tiny, dilapidated box was their entire universe, a fragile bastion against a world that saw them as nothing more than disposable components in a vast agricultural machine. 3-year-old Claire was the quiet, warm center of that universe. She was a child of sunlight and soft giggles, her world consisting of the cabin's worn floorboards, the feel of her father's rough shirt, and the constant, steady presence of her older brother. Ethan had become her secondary guardian by necessity, learning to soothe her cries, to distract her from her hunger with stories, and to keep her safe while their father was swallowed by the fields. He carried a weight of responsibility far beyond his years, a silent understanding that he was the second line of defense. His love for her was a fierce, instinctual thing, a promise he had made to his father without ever needing to speak the words aloud. He was her protector, a role he accepted with a gravity that had settled deep into his young bones. Some of his most cherished memories were of his father's hands, not when they were working the fields, but when they were showing him the magic hidden within the earth. On the rare Sundays William wasn't forced to work, he would take Ethan to a small, neglected patch of land behind their cabin. He'd crumble the dark, rich soil between his fingers, calling it black gold, and explain the secrets of seeds and roots. He taught Ethan how to read the language of plants, to understand the subtle signs of thirst or sickness, to know which mushrooms were a gift and which were a warning. These were not idle lessons. They were a legacy, the only inheritance a man like William Carter could pass down. He was planting knowledge in his son, seeds of survival that neither of them knew would one day be all Ethan had left to cultivate. The architect of their hardship was Raymond Blackwell, a man whose name was spoken in whispers among the workers. Blackwell owned everything: the land, the cabins, the company store where workers were forced to buy provisions at inflated prices, their costs deducted from already pitiful wages. It was a perfectly calibrated system of modern serfdom, designed to ensure that no family could ever save enough to leave. There were no sick days, no paid time off, no compassion. A worker's value was measured solely by the number of tobacco leaves they could harvest in a day. To fall behind, to get sick, to slow down, these were unforgivable sins in Blackwell's kingdom, and they were punished with immediate replacement. The farm was a revolving door of desperate families, each one hoping for a foothold and finding only a cliff's edge. Despite the oppressive weight of their existence, small moments of light would occasionally break through the gloom. Ethan remembered one evening when a summer storm had forced the foreman to call off work early. His father had come home while the sun was still in the sky, a rare and startling event. He'd brought with him a handful of wild blackberries, and the three of them sat on the porch steps, the air thick with the smell of rain, sharing the sweet, dark fruit. In that moment, William wasn't a laborer. He was just a father. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that transformed his tired face, and for a few precious minutes, the vast, menacing machinery of the Blackwell farms seemed to fade into the background, leaving only a family, whole and at peace. The memory of his mother was a faint, watercolor image in Ethan's mind, more a feeling than a collection of clear pictures. He remembered a soft voice singing and the scent of lavender. Her absence was a constant unspoken ache in their small home, a void that William tried to fill with his own relentless efforts. Her loss had been the catalyst for his father's descent into overwork, a desperate attempt to be both mother and father, provider and nurturer. He worked to outrun the grief, to build a wall of labor between his family and the crushing reality of their vulnerability. Every extra hour in the field was an act of love, a sacrifice laid at the altar of his children's survival, a payment made in the currency of his own life force. Ethan was not blind to the toll it was taking. He was a quiet, observant boy, and he saw the changes in his father that others might have missed. He saw the way William's shoulders stooped a little lower each month, the persistent dry cough that rattled his chest in the mornings, and the growing pallor beneath his sun-darkened skin. Fear became a constant companion for Ethan, a cold knot in his stomach that tightened every time his father seemed to stumble from sheer exhaustion. He started leaving a glass of water by the door for when William returned, a small inadequate gesture against a tide of depletion that was pulling his father further and further away from them. He knew with a child's unerring intuition that they were living on borrowed time. The system was designed for this outcome. To Raymond Blackwell, a worn-out worker was no different from a broken tool, to be discarded and replaced without a second thought. There was no concept of loyalty or gratitude. Men and women gave their entire lives to his fields. Their youth and strength plowed directly into his profits, and in return, they received just enough to keep them working until they could work no more. The idea of severance, of a reward for years of service, was a bitter joke. The only severance a worker could expect from Blackwell was to be cut loose the moment their body failed them, their families left to fend for themselves, their empty cabin immediately filled by the next desperate soul in line. The final day began like any other, under a sky of pale, hazy blue that promised another day of suffocating heat. William had risen in the darkness, his movements slow and pained. Before he left, he placed his hand on Ethan's head, a familiar morning ritual. "Be a good boy, Ethan," he'd whispered, his voice rough with fatigue. "Look after your sister. I'll be back before you know it." Those were the last words Ethan would ever hear from him. He watched his father's silhouette merge with the grey twilight, a solitary figure walking toward the endless rows of green until he was completely gone, swallowed by the vastness of the farm. That evening, Ethan put Claire to bed and sat on the porch steps waiting. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The familiar sounds of the evening settled in, the chirping of crickets, the distant murmur of other families in their cabins, but the one sound he was listening for, the heavy, rhythmic tread of his father's work boots on the dirt path, never came. An hour passed, then two. The knot of fear in his stomach grew into a cold, sharp dread. Every shadow seemed to take his father's shape, only to dissolve into nothingness. The world grew dark, and the silence from the path stretched into a terrifying, unnatural void. The knock on the door came just after 10 o'clock. It wasn't the familiar, gentle rap of his father, but a hard, impatient sound. Standing on their doorstep was one of the farm's foremen, a man with a perpetually grim expression, his face illuminated by the single bare bulb above the door. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He looked past Ethan, his eyes cold and detached, and delivered the news with brutal efficiency. There had been an incident in the fields, a collapse. William Carter was gone. The words hung in the humid night air, simple, clinical, and utterly devastating, shattering the fragile universe contained within the cabin's walls. In that moment, the world for Ethan Carter split into two distinct parts, the time before and the endless, terrifying time after. He didn't cry, not at first. He simply stood in the doorway, the foreman's words echoing in the sudden, immense silence. He felt a profound and chilling emptiness descend, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. He turned and looked back into the small, dimly lit room, at his little sister sleeping peacefully in her cot, completely unaware that her world had just been irrevocably broken. He closed the door on the foreman's impassive face, walked over to Claire's side, and understood with a clarity that was both horrifying and absolute that he was now completely and utterly alone. The night that followed was a landscape of fractured sleep and whispered reassurances to a restless Claire. Ethan felt as if he were floating in a dark, cold ocean, the familiar contours of their small cabin feeling alien and vast in his father's absence. The morning arrived not with the gentle promise of a new day, but with a harsh grey light that seemed to strip all colour from their world. The usual morning sounds of the farm, the distant rumble of a tractor, the crowing of a rooster, felt mocking, a reminder that life for everyone else was proceeding as normal while his had come to a dead stop. He moved through the motions of their morning routine with a mechanical slowness, feeding Claire the last of their oatmeal and watching her play on the floor, her innocent babbling a stark counterpoint to the roaring silence in his own head. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the thin walls sounded like a prelude to something terrible. The sound, when it came, was exactly as he had feared. It wasn't the soft knock of a neighbor bringing condolences, but a hard percussive rap on the wooden door, a sound of authority and impatience. It was the sound of the farm itself, of the system that had consumed his father now coming for what was left. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He instinctively moved to stand between the door and his sister, a small, futile barrier against the world. He knew who was on the other side. It was the same foreman from the night before, the man with eyes that held no light, no pity. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his small hand hovering over the rusted iron latch, knowing that opening that door would mean letting the final, devastating truth into their home. He pulled the door open, the morning light spilling in and momentarily blinding him. The foreman's silhouette filled the doorway, a dark and imposing shape against the bright sky. The man's face was a mask of indifference, his gaze sweeping over Ethan and into the cabin, as if he were inspecting a piece of equipment rather than a home filled with grief. He didn't offer a greeting or a word of sympathy. His presence was purely functional, a cog in the Blackwell machine sent to perform a simple, heartless task. The air grew thick with unspoken finality, and Ethan felt himself shrink under the man's cold, appraising stare, the last vestiges of his childhood security evaporating in the harsh morning sun. He clutched the edge of the door, his knuckles white, bracing himself for the words he knew were coming. The foreman spoke, his voice as flat and barren as the dusty road he stood on. He didn't waste time with euphemisms. He laid out the policy of the Blackwell tobacco farms with a brutal clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. The housing, he explained, was tied directly to the labor. With the laborer, William Carter, deceased, his family's right to occupy the cabin was terminated, effective immediately. He used words like asset and property, clinical terms that reduced their home to a line item on a ledger. There was no acknowledgement of their loss, no recognition of their humanity. They were simply a problem to be cleared away, an administrative loose end to be tied up, so that the relentless cycle of production could continue without interruption. Then came the sentence that would sever his last tie to the world he knew. "You have 24 hours to vacate the premises," the foreman stated, his eyes fixed somewhere over Ethan's head. The words didn't feel real. 24 hours. It was an impossibly small amount of time, a cruel ticking clock counting down to absolute destitution. The number echoed in the cavernous space of Ethan's shock. One day, 24 hours to pack up a life that had just been shattered, to find a new place to exist in a world where they had nowhere to go. He felt the floor beneath him tilt, the solid ground of his reality crumbling into a terrifying abyss. He could only stare at the man, his own voice lost somewhere in the tightening knot of panic in his throat. Ethan looked up at the foreman, his eyes pleading for the mercy the man's voice refused to offer. He tried to find some flicker of compassion in the man's weathered face, some sign that he was speaking to a person and not just an enforcer of rules. But there was nothing. The foreman's expression remained unchanged, a stony mask of professional detachment. This man had likely delivered the same news dozens of times before. He was the final gear in a machine designed by Raymond Blackwell, a machine that ran on human exhaustion and was oiled with indifference. To him, this was not a tragedy. It was a simple transaction, the closing of an account. The silence stretched between them, filled only by Ethan's desperate, unspoken appeal and the foreman's unyielding resolve. The boy's mind, reeling with shock, suddenly flashed to a memory from 6 months prior. He remembered the Martinez family who lived 3 cabins down. Mr. Martinez had fallen from a curing barn and broken his leg, unable to work. Ethan had watched, hidden behind a stack of barrels, as this same foreman delivered the same news. The very next day, he saw their belongings, a mattress, a few boxes, a child's worn teddy bear, piled on the side of the dirt road. He remembered the sight of Mrs. Martinez weeping while her children huddled beside her, their faces etched with a confusion and fear that he now understood completely. The abstract threat of the foreman's words suddenly became a concrete, vivid image in his mind. This wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. This was what the farm did. It discarded the broken. As if to erase any lingering doubt, the foreman added one final, chillingly practical detail. "The new family arrives tomorrow at noon to take possession," he said, his tone suggesting he was merely coordinating a delivery. "Make sure the cabin is clear of all personal effects. Blackwell doesn't like loose ends." The statement was a final, brutal confirmation that their life here was over. They were not just being evicted, they were being replaced. Their existence erased and overwritten within a single rotation of the earth. The mention of a new family made it painfully clear that their home, the only sanctuary he and Claire had ever known, was already promised to someone else. They were just ghosts who hadn't left the building yet. Without another word, the foreman turned on his heel and walked away, his heavy work boots crunching on the gravel path. He didn't look back. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, watching the man's rigid back recede until he was just another figure swallowed by the vastness of the farm. The morning air, which had felt cool just moments before, now felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of their impending homelessness. He slowly, deliberately, closed the door. The soft click of the latch, sounding as final as a gavel strike. The four walls of the cabin no longer felt like a shelter. They felt like a cage, its door now wide open to a world that had no place for them. He leaned his forehead against the rough wood of the door, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A wave of nausea washed over him. He turned, and his gaze fell upon Claire. She had managed to crawl over to the leg of the table and was trying to pull herself up, a look of intense concentration on her small face before she giggled and plopped back down onto the floor. She was completely oblivious, her world still safe, still whole, protected by the brother who now had less than 24 hours to figure out how to save them both. In that moment, the full, crushing weight of his new reality settled upon him. He was 10 years old, and he was the only thing standing between his little sister and the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the world. That night was a crucible of cold and fear. Huddled under the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree at the ravine's edge, Ethan held Claire tight against his chest, her small body trembling with a mixture of chill and confusion. The sounds of the night, once familiar and comforting, now seemed predatory. Every rustle of leaves was a foreman's footstep, every hoot of a distant owl a sound of judgment. He stared into the black, gaping mouth of the ravine, the gift from Raymond Blackwell. It was a place of shadows, a vertical scar on the earth intended to be their tomb. Yet as Claire's soft, whimpering cries pierced the darkness, a cold, hard certainty began to crystallize in Ethan's young mind. There was no one coming for them. There was no other door to knock on. The world had cast them out, and this dark, forgotten place was the only thing it had left them. The humiliation on the porch had burned away any last childish hope for mercy. Survival was no longer a hope. It was a command. As the first faint hint of grey light began to bleed into the eastern sky, the fear of the night solidified into a plan. It was a fragile, desperate thing, a plan built not on strategy but on sheer necessity. He could not simply walk into that ravine empty-handed and wait to die. He needed tools. He needed a future. And the only future he could imagine was locked away in the memory of his father's hands, crumbling dark soil and whispering about the magic of seeds. The cabin. He had to go back one last time. The new family wasn't due until noon. The foreman's words echoed in his head, a cruel, ticking clock. He had a window, a small, dangerous sliver of time to reclaim the fragments of their life before they were erased completely. The thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through his exhausted body, a purpose that was sharper and more real than the hunger gnawing at his stomach. He gently adjusted his tattered jacket, fashioning it into a makeshift sling to secure Claire to his back. Waking her would invite cries, and cries would invite discovery. It was better this way to let her sleep through the most dangerous part of their journey, her small, warm weight a constant living reminder of what he was fighting for. The 6-kilometer walk back to the workers' cabins felt like traversing a foreign and hostile country. He stayed off the main dirt roads, sticking to the shadows along the edges of the tobacco fields, his small body moving with a stealth he didn't know he possessed. Every distant sound, the cough of a tractor engine starting up, the bark of a dog, sent his heart racing, forcing him to freeze behind a bush or a stack of barrels, his breath held tight in his chest. He was a trespasser in the place he had once called home, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. When he finally reached the row of cabins, his own stood out in its stark emptiness. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the morning breeze, an invitation and a warning all at once. He slipped inside, his bare feet silent on the worn floorboards that had so often creaked under his father's weight. The space was hollow, stripped of the few meager pieces of furniture they had owned, echoing with the ghosts of their laughter and sorrows. For a moment, the sheer emptiness threatened to overwhelm him, a physical manifestation of his loss. But there was no time for grief. He moved with a grim efficiency, his eyes scanning the barren room for anything that could be of use, his mind a sharp, focused instrument of survival. This was not a home anymore. It was a resource to be plundered before it was lost forever. His gaze fell upon a small, dusty corner near where their makeshift pantry had been. There it was, a half-empty burlap sack, overlooked and discarded in the hasty clearing. He knelt and untied the twine, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside were the small paper packets of seeds his father had been saving for a spring garden that would never be planted. Lettuce, spinach, herbs. They felt impossibly light in his hand, yet they held the weight of a promise, a tangible link to his father's belief in the earth's generosity. He carefully secured the sack, the small, rattling packet sounding like the most precious currency in the world. This was more than just food. It was a legacy, a collection of tiny, dormant lives entrusted to his care. It was the first piece of his new world. His search continued. He found the threadbare blanket they used on the coldest nights, tossed in a heap near the back door, deemed too worn and worthless for the farm to bother with. He gathered it up, its familiar rough texture a small comfort against his skin. Then his eyes caught a glint of metal outside, just beneath the back step. It was the small hand trowel, its wooden handle weathered and its metal blade stained with the rich red soil of North Carolina. It was half buried in the dirt, forgotten where his father had last left it. A tool, not just a tool for digging, but a tool for building, for creating something from nothing. He clutched it tightly, a bag of seeds, a thin blanket, and a rusted trowel. It was a pitifully small arsenal to wage a war against starvation, but it was everything he had. With his meager treasures secured, Ethan stood in the doorway for one final, fleeting moment. He took a long, silent look at the empty room, a silent farewell to the only home he had ever known. He was no longer the boy who had waited on the porch for his father to return. That boy was gone, lost in the suffocating silence of the last 48 hours. In his place stood someone new, someone harder, forged in the fires of grief and abandonment. He adjusted the sleeping weight of his sister on his back, her soft, even breaths a steady rhythm against the frantic beating of his own heart. He slipped out of the cabin without a sound, turning his back on it for the last time. He did not look back. His face was set toward the northern edge of the property, toward the dark promise of the ravine. The decision was made. The preparation was over. The only path left was down. The journey back was a silent, desperate race against the rising sun. Every step Ethan took away from the cabin was a step into an unknown so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. He moved with a purpose that felt foreign in his own body, a grim determination that had settled over him like a second skin. With Claire's sleeping form secured to his back in the makeshift sling, her small weight was both a burden and a compass, a constant living reason to keep moving forward. He avoided the familiar dirt paths, now arteries of potential discovery, and instead hugged the long dark shadows cast by the endless rows of tobacco plants. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth and dew, a smell he had always associated with the start of his father's workday, but which now smelled only of escape. The bag of seeds and the trowel bumped softly against his hip, a meager arsenal for the war he was about to wage. He had not gone more than 500 yards when the first sound of the waking farm cut through the morning stillness. It was the guttural cough and rumble of a tractor engine turning over in the distance, a familiar noise that now sounded like a predator stirring from its slumber. The sound was a switch, flipping his fear from a dull ache to a sharp, electric panic. He dove instinctively into the dense, overgrown brush that lined a drainage ditch, his body hitting the damp ground with a soft thud. He held his breath, pressing one hand gently against Claire's back to keep her from shifting. his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The tractor's engine settled into a low, steady drone, a monstrous heartbeat signaling that his window of invisibility was rapidly closing. The world was waking up, and he was a ghost that needed to stay in the shadows. Minutes later, a new threat emerged. The soft, rhythmic crunch of boots on the gravel of a nearby path. Ethan pressed himself deeper into the foliage, the wet leaves cold against his cheek. He peered through a small gap and saw one of the farmhands, a man he recognized from the curing barns, walking past not 20 feet from his hiding spot. The man was lost in his own world, whistling a tuneless melody, a tin lunch pail swinging from his hand. For a terrifyingly long moment, the man's path seemed to veer directly toward him. Ethan's entire body went rigid, a statue carved from fear. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the shout of discovery. But then, the man adjusted his course, continuing down the path without a single glance in his direction. The footsteps faded, and Ethan allowed himself a slow, shaky exhale, the close call leaving him trembling and acutely aware of how fragile his freedom was. The physical reality of his task began to set in with a brutal, grinding intensity. The 6-kilometer trek was a monumental undertaking for his 10-year-old legs, made infinitely more difficult by the precious cargo on his back. Claire, who had always felt so light in his arms, now seemed to be made of lead. The straps of his jacket dug deep into his shoulders, sending sharp, burning pains down his arms. Each step was a negotiation with exhaustion, his muscles screaming in protest. The sun was climbing higher, the cool morning air giving way to the familiar oppressive humidity of a North Carolina summer, and a sheen of sweat slicked his forehead. He was no longer just running from a threat, he was battling the limitations of his own small body, a body that felt woefully unequipped for the burden it was forced to carry. He pushed onward, his world shrinking to the next step and the one after that. He knew he couldn't maintain the pace. His legs felt like jelly, and his breathing came in ragged, shallow gasps. Spotting a dense thicket of blackberry bushes near the edge of a fallow field, he saw his chance for a brief respite. He slipped behind the thorny curtain, the tangled branches providing a screen of natural camouflage, and gently eased Claire from his back, laying her down on the soft, mossy ground. She stirred for a moment, a soft whimper escaping her lips, and he quickly put a finger to her mouth, shushing her with a gentleness that belied the frantic terror in his heart. She settled back into a deep sleep, oblivious. He uncapped the small water bottle he'd managed to fill at the cabin's outdoor spigot and took a small, careful sip, rationing the precious liquid. The water was cool against his parched throat, a momentary reprieve in a journey that felt endless. In the relative safety of the thicket, the adrenaline that had been fueling him began to recede, leaving a cold, heavy dread in its place. The sheer impossibility of what he was attempting to do crashed down upon him. He was a boy armed with a handful of seeds and a rusty trowel, leading his baby sister to a hole in the ground. The image was so absurd, so pathetic, that a wave of despair washed over him, threatening to drown him. For a moment his body refused to move. The thought of just staying there, of giving up, was a seductive whisper in the back of his mind. But then, an image of his father's face surfaced, not the tired, worn-out man of his last days, but the father who had smiled while showing him how to plant a seed. The memory was a spark in the darkness, a reminder that he was carrying more than just a bag of seeds. He was carrying a legacy of survival. Steeled by the memory, he gathered Claire back onto his back and pressed on, only to find his path blocked. The shortcut he had planned to take, a well-worn track across an open pasture, was now occupied. Two foremen stood near a fence post, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sky. They were talking, gesturing towards the main farm buildings, their presence turning the open field into a deadly, exposed stage. To cross it would be to guarantee capture. A hot spike of panic shot through him. He had no other plan. He was trapped between the waking farm behind him and the watchful eyes of its enforcers ahead. His mind raced, scrambling for an alternative, for any route that didn't lead directly into the hands of the men who had cast him out. Time was a luxury he did not have. The decision came to him not as a thought, but as an instinct. To the left of the pasture was a dense stretch of woods, a tangled mess of pine and undergrowth that the farmhands usually avoided. It would be slower, the terrain far more difficult, but it offered the one thing he needed above all else: cover. There was no time to weigh the options. He immediately veered away from the open field, his body moving before his mind had fully processed the choice, and plunged into the cool, dark embrace of the forest. The change in environment was immediate and jarring. The open air was replaced by a close, earthy smell of pine needles and damp soil. The world became a labyrinth of tree trunks and low-hanging branches that snagged at his clothes and whipped against his face. Progress slowed to a crawl. He was no longer running but navigating, pushing his way through thick brush and climbing over fallen logs. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of roots and loose rocks, and he stumbled several times, catching himself just before he fell, his arms wrapped protectively around his sister. The sounds of the farm faded, replaced by the sounds of the woods, the chatter of a squirrel, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind through the high canopy. It was a different kind of danger here, a wilderness that was indifferent to his plight, but offered a refuge from the calculated cruelty of men. He moved with a heightened sense of awareness, every snap of a twig sounding like a gunshot in the profound silence. After what felt like an hour of struggling through the dense woods, he came to another obstacle, a shallow but wide creek that snaked through the forest. The water, brown and murky from recent rains, moved with a surprising swiftness. He walked along the muddy bank, his eyes scanning for any possible crossing point. There was no bridge, no clear path. The water was too deep to wade through without soaking their only blanket and supplies, and the cold shock would surely wake Claire. For a moment, he felt a familiar flicker of despair. It seemed as if every step forward only revealed a new, more difficult barrier. But then he saw it, a large, moss-covered boulder, sitting almost perfectly in the middle of the stream, creating two shorter, more manageable gaps of rushing water. It was a risk, a significant one. The surface of the rock was slick with moss and moisture, and a fall would be disastrous. He stood at the edge, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm. He checked the straps holding Claire, making sure she was as secure as possible. He took a deep, steadying breath, his eyes fixed on the landing spot on the boulder. He backed up a few paces, got a running start, and leaped. His feet hit the mossy surface, slipping for a terrifying second before finding purchase. Without pausing, he gathered himself and launched himself again, landing with a jarring thud on the soft earth of the opposite bank. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had made it. The small, successful act of defiance against the indifferent landscape felt like a monumental victory. From the other side of the creek, the terrain began to change. The dense undergrowth thinned, and he recognized the familiar shapes of the ancient gnarled oak trees that grew along the northern perimeter of the Blackwell property. He could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in temperature, as the ground began to slope downwards. He was close. The knowledge sent a fresh surge of energy through his aching limbs. He pushed through the last stretch of woods and finally emerged into a small clearing. And there it was. The ravine. A great dark scar in the earth, its edges shrouded in shadow. He had reached the place he was sent to disappear. The long, terrifying flight was over. He stood at the precipice, the sleeping child on his back, the weight of their future as vast and deep as the chasm before him. The final step into the clearing felt like stepping off the edge of the world. The ravine was not a gentle slope, but a sudden, violent slash in the earth, a 50-meter drop into shadow and silence. From the precipice, Ethan could see the tops of trees growing from its depths, their leaves a dark, rich green that seemed to drink the light. The air itself felt different here, cooler and heavier, as if carrying the weight of the chasm's solitude. He stood there for a long moment, the sun warm on his back and the cool breath of the ravine on his face, a boy caught between two worlds. The long, frantic escape was over, but the most dangerous part of the journey was just beginning. He looked down into the abyss that Raymond Blackwell had intended as his grave, took a steadying breath, and began the slow, painstaking descent into the unknown, a sleeping child, his only anchor. The descent was less a walk and more a controlled fall, a vertical negotiation with gravity. He moved sideways, his small body pressed against the steep, unstable slope, his fingers digging into the loose soil and curling around exposed roots that snaked through the earth like arthritic fingers. Each step was a test of faith in the ground beneath his feet. Small cascades of pebbles and dirt broke loose with every movement, skittering down into the depths and disappearing into the shadows below. He kept one arm wrapped tightly around Claire, shielding her small body with his own, her soft, even breaths a stark contrast to his own ragged, panicked gasps. The world became a narrow, tactile focus, the rough bark of a root, the sharp edge of a rock, the damp, earthy smell of the disturbed soil. It was an agonizingly slow process, a journey measured in inches, not feet, as he lowered them both into the waiting darkness. Reaching the bottom was not a triumphant arrival, but a soft, stumbling collapse onto the cool, damp floor of the ravine. The transition was immediate and profound. The oppressive heat of the sun vanished, replaced by a deep, cellar-like cold that clung to his skin. The sounds of the world above, the wind, the distant farm noises were gone, muffled by the sheer rock walls that rose up on either side like the nave of a stone cathedral. The silence here was a living thing, broken only by the sound of his own heavy breathing and the gentle, melodic trickle of water from somewhere nearby. Light filtered down from the narrow opening far above, a perpetual twilight that painted everything in soft, muted tones of green and grey. He had arrived in a hidden world, a place completely disconnected from the one that had cast him out, and in its isolation he felt the first, fragile flicker of safety. He gently unfastened the jacket from his shoulders and carefully laid Claire down on a patch of soft, thick moss. She stirred, her small brow furrowed in her sleep, and then her eyes fluttered open. She didn't cry. She simply looked up at the towering rock walls and the sliver of bright sky so far above, her expression one of pure, innocent wonder. Ethan knelt beside her, his exhaustion a heavy cloak on his shoulders, and put a finger to her lips, a silent plea for quiet. He then took the threadbare blanket and wrapped it snugly around her, creating a small, warm cocoon against the damp chill of the ravine floor. For a few minutes he just sat there with her, the two of them small and insignificant in the vast, silent space. He watched her tiny chest rise and fall, and a fierce, protective resolve hardened within him. This place had to be their sanctuary. He had to make it one. The sound of trickling water, which had been a background hum, now became a siren's call to his parched throat. Following the sound, he discovered its source, a small, clear spring weeping from a fissure in the rock face about 20 feet away. The water pooled in a shallow basin of smooth stones before overflowing and soaking into the dark soil. He approached it with a sense of reverence, his thirst suddenly acute. Kneeling down, he scooped the water into his cupped hands. It was shockingly cold, pure and clean, with a sweet mineral taste that felt like life itself. He drank deeply, the water soothing the raw, dusty ache in his throat. He then filled the small bottle he had carried and brought it back to Claire, patiently helping her take small, careful sips. This simple act, finding and drinking clean water, felt like their first victory, a fundamental claim staked in this wild, forgotten place. With their immediate thirst quenched, his next instinct was shelter. The open floor of the ravine felt too exposed, too vulnerable even in its isolation. His eyes scanned the base of the rock walls until he found what he was looking for, a shallow overhang, a natural concavity in the stone that offered a degree of protection from above. Using the small rusted trowel and his bare hands, he cleared the area of loose rocks and debris. Then he gathered fallen branches, leaning the longer, sturdier ones against the rock wall and weaving smaller, leafier branches between them to create a crude but effective lean-to. He draped their single blanket over the top, creating a small, dark space shielded from the elements. It was a pathetic imitation of a home, but as he crawled inside, the enclosed space felt like a fortress, a tiny pocket of order carved out of the wilderness. That first night was a long, dark vigil. The perpetual twilight of the day gave way to an absolute, ink-black darkness that swallowed all shapes and outlines. The familiar constellations of the night sky were completely hidden, replaced by a narrow, star-dusted ribbon of space far above. The sounds of the ravine were different at night. The trickle of the spring seemed louder, and the silence was punctuated by the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth and the whisper of air currents moving through the canyon. Ethan lay awake for hours, Claire sleeping soundly beside him, his hand resting on her back. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it had changed. It was no longer the fear of men with hard eyes and eviction notices. It was an older, more primal fear of the dark and the unknown, and somehow that felt more manageable. He was no longer being hunted. He was simply hidden. The days that followed fell into a slow, quiet rhythm. Morning was a gradual brightening of the ravine, a slow descent of soft light. His world shrank to the 50-meter-long stretch of the canyon floor, a self-contained universe of rock, soil, and water. He spent his time exploring every inch of their new home, his initial terror slowly giving way to a deep, observational knowledge of the place. He learned where the moss grew thickest, which rocks were stable enough to climb, and where the morning light first touched the canyon floor. He foraged for edible greens he recognized from his father's lessons, wild sorrel and dandelion, to supplement their non-existent diet. The gnawing hunger was a constant companion, but the immediate threat of discovery had receded, replaced by the more fundamental challenges of survival. He was no longer a fugitive, he was an inhabitant. It was during one of these quiet explorations that he truly began to see the potential of his prison. He was digging near the base of the spring with his trowel, hoping to find edible roots, when he plunged the tool into the ground. Instead of the hard, rocky clay he was used to from the farm, the trowel sank easily into the soil. He pulled up a clump and crumbled it between his fingers. It was dark, almost black, and rich with the smell of damp earth and decay. It was exactly what his father had called black gold, soil created from decades of fallen, decomposing leaves, enriched by the constant moisture from the spring. A memory surfaced with startling clarity. His father holding a handful of this same kind of earth, explaining that soil like this could grow almost anything, that it was a gift. He looked around the ravine at the floor covered in this precious fertile earth, and the first seed of a new idea began to germinate in his mind. He found them 3 days after arriving, tucked away in the deepest shade of the ravine. His eyes, now fully accustomed to the low light, were scanning the forest of fallen logs and decaying stumps when he saw it. On a large, moss-covered log, half buried in the dark soil, was a cluster of small umbrella-shaped growths. His heart gave a sudden hard thump against his ribs. He moved closer, his steps slow and cautious, as if approaching a sleeping animal. He knelt in the dirt, his eyes tracing the familiar shape of the brown caps, the pale gills underneath, the way they grew in a tight, overlapping bloom. He had seen them before dozens of times, piled high in baskets at the farmer's market in Asheville, the place his father had taken him on a few rare, happy occasions. He knew what they were, but the sheer improbability of finding them here, in this place, made his mind hesitate. With a trembling hand he reached out and touched one. The cap was smooth and slightly leathery, cool to the touch. He gently broke it from its stem. The scent that rose from the broken flesh was unmistakable, a rich, earthy and slightly smoky aroma that instantly transported him back to the bustling market, to the vendor who had let him hold one and called it a delicacy. Shiitake, wild shiitake mushrooms, a gourmet variety that he knew from listening to the vendor's sales pitch, commanded a surprisingly high price. The knowledge hit him not as a thought, but as a physical shock, a jolt of electricity that shot through his entire body. He was holding a small brown fungus, but it felt as heavy and as valuable as a piece of gold. It was a discovery so profound, so completely unexpected, that it seemed to bend the reality of his situation. He remained kneeling there for a long time, the mushroom still clutched in his hand, the rich, dark soil cool between the fingers of his other. Claire was asleep a few feet away, wrapped in their blanket under the crude shelter of branches he had built. For days this place had been a tomb, a vertical grave gifted to them by a cruel man as a final act of contempt. It was meant to be the end of their story, but in that moment, staring at the impossible bloom of life growing on a dead log, he felt a profound and powerful shift inside him. A breath he didn't know he had been holding for days, a breath tight with fear and despair escaped his lungs in a long, shuddering sigh. And for the first time since he had watched his father's silhouette disappear into the morning mist for the last time, a feeling that was not fear, not hunger, but a fragile electric flicker of pure possibility coursed through him. He looked around the ravine again, but this time with new eyes. He saw not a prison, but an ecosystem. He saw the sheer rock walls not as barriers, but as vertical surfaces that trapped moisture and created a perfect shaded microclimate. He saw the constant spring not just as drinking water, but as a source of irrigation. He saw the rich, dark soil not just as ground to walk on, but as a fertile bed for cultivation. And he saw the wild shiitake not as a lucky find, but as proof of concept, a testament to the unique potential of this place. Everything his father had ever taught him about the language of the earth, about the secrets of shade and soil and water, all of it coalesced into a single brilliant moment of clarity. This place was not an end. It was an incubator. His gaze fell upon the small burlap sack at the entrance of their lean-to, the one containing his father's precious packets of seeds. Lettuce, spinach, herbs, shade-tolerant crops. It all clicked into place, a key turning in a lock he didn't even know was there. Raymond Blackwell, in his infinite arrogance and cruelty, had given him the one piece of land on his entire property that was perfectly suited for the knowledge his father had left him. He had inadvertently provided the exact environment needed for his meager inheritance to flourish. A slow smile spread across Ethan's face, the first genuine smile in what felt like a lifetime. It was a smile of defiance, of dawning hope, and of a terrible, beautiful irony. He looked at his sleeping sister, then back at the mushrooms in his hand, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that they were not going to die here. They were going to grow. It was in the 4th month, as Ethan was clearing a new, deeper section of the ravine to expand his herb garden, that his trowel struck something that was not rock or root. The sound was a dull, metallic thud, a note of discord in the symphony of soft earth. Curiosity overriding his exhaustion, he dug around the object, his small hands working with a focused intensity. Slowly, he unearthed a small rusted metal box, the kind a worker might use to store tools or personal effects. It was heavy, sealed shut by years of dampness and corrosion. He recognized the crude initials scratched into the lid immediately, a WC carved with the tip of a knife. William Carter. It was his father's. A sudden, sharp pang of grief and memory shot through him, so intense it almost buckled his knees. He had found a ghost, a final buried piece of the man who had been his entire world, hidden here in the last place on earth he would have ever expected. He carried the box back to their small tent, his heart hammering against his ribs with a mixture of hope and dread. Claire was napping inside, her breath a soft, rhythmic whisper. He sat at the entrance, the box resting on his knees, and worked at the rusted latch with the edge of his trowel. For long minutes it refused to yield, but finally, with a groan of tortured metal, the lid popped open. The air that escaped smelled of rust and old paper and something else, something deeply familiar, the faint lingering scent of tobacco and his father's work clothes. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like old dried leaves, was a small worn leather pouch, a faded photograph of a smiling woman he barely recognized as his mother, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He picked up the bird, its surface smoothed by the touch of his father's hands, and a memory of sitting on the cabin porch, watching those same hands whittle this very object, flooded his mind. He opened the leather pouch first, his fingers fumbling with the drawstring. Inside was a small, tight roll of cash. He carefully unrolled it, his eyes widening as he counted. $187. It was an impossible sum, a fortune beyond anything he could have imagined their family possessing. A wave of confusion washed over him. Why had his father hidden this? This money could have bought them better food, medicine for his father's cough, a brief respite from the crushing weight of their poverty. It made no sense. It felt like a betrayal, a secret kept while they suffered. He stared at the worn bills, the faces of forgotten presidents looking up at him, and felt a cold knot of resentment begin to form in his stomach. This money could have changed everything, and yet his father had buried it in the dirt, leaving them with nothing when he was gone. Beneath the pouch, there was one last item, a single sheet of paper, folded into a small, tight square and stained with oil and dirt. It was a letter. His hands trembled as he unfolded it, the paper so fragile it felt like it might disintegrate in his grasp. The handwriting was his father's, a rough but careful script that he had only ever seen on lists for the company store. He took a deep, shuddering breath and began to read. The first words were a simple, devastating salutation. To my son, Ethan. In that moment, the ravine, his sister, his entire struggle for survival seemed to fade away, leaving only the silent, powerful voice of his father speaking to him from beyond the grave, a final conversation he never thought he would have. The world contracted to the piece of paper in his hands, each word a sacred artifact from a life that had been stolen from them. The letter was a confession, a final accounting of a man who knew he was running out of time. His father wrote of the pain in his chest, of a weakness in his heart that he had tried to ignore, but that had grown worse with each passing month. He knew he was dying. The realization hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. All those months he had watched his father grow thinner, more tired. He had seen it as the simple result of overwork. He never imagined it was a conscious, deliberate race against a known end. The extra shifts, the 15-hour days that Ethan had resented for stealing his father away from them, were not just for their daily bread. They were a desperate, frantic effort to scrape together the money in the pouch, a secret escape fund to get them away from Blackwell, away from the farm that was killing him, before it was too late. Every line of the letter reshaped his memory, transforming his understanding of the man he thought he knew. His father's exhaustion was not a surrender. It was a battle. The silence at the dinner table was not indifference. It was the heavy weight of a secret he couldn't bear to share. He had buried the money because he feared Blackwell's system of debt, knew that any cash he kept openly would be repossessed or stolen. He was building a lifeboat in secret, nail by painful nail, even as the storm was already breaking over him. He had been trying to save them, not just from poverty, but from the future he saw coming. And he had failed, he had run out of time. The letter was filled with a father's profound, heartbreaking apology for not being strong enough, for leaving them alone, for his body giving out before his will had. Then came the words that broke through the dam of grief Ethan had been holding back for 4 long months. You are smarter and stronger than I ever was, his father had written. I taught you about the earth because it is the only thing that is honest. It will give back what you put into it. That knowledge is your true inheritance, more than any money I could leave. Look after your sister. You are my heart, you and Claire. You are my harvest. The tears came then, hot and silent at first, then racking his small body with deep, shuddering sobs. They were not tears of fear or hunger, but tears of a profound, overwhelming love. He had not been abandoned. He had not been forgotten. His father had been fighting for him until his very last breath, planning for a future he knew he would never see. He clutched the letter and the small wooden bird to his chest, pressing them so tightly he could feel the sharp edges of the carving against his ribs. He was not just the victim of a cruel man's whim. He was the son of a quiet hero. His survival in this ravine, his ability to coax life from this dark soil, was not an accident. It was the fulfillment of a legacy. Every seed he planted, every mushroom he harvested, was a continuation of his father's fight. He had thought he was alone, a forgotten boy at the bottom of a hole in the ground, but he had been wrong. His father's love was right here with him, in the knowledge in his head, in the strength in his hands, and in the letter that had finally set his grief free. The discovery of the box changed the very soil of Ethan's soul. The daily struggle for survival, once a grim and lonely task, was now infused with a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer just working for himself and Claire. He was honoring his father's sacrifice. He used the $187 not as an escape fund, but as an investment. He bought a sturdy second-hand tent, proper tools, and a wider variety of seeds, transforming their crude campsite into a more permanent, efficient homestead. The ravine was no longer a place of exile. It became a living monument to his father's faith in him, a sanctuary built on a foundation of love and watered by the memory of a quiet, desperate courage. He was cultivating his inheritance, and it was beginning to flourish in the most unlikely of places. The world outside the ravine eventually found him, not through malice but through a customer's concern. A social worker named Evelyn Chen arrived one autumn afternoon, expecting to find children in peril, but instead discovered a thriving, self-sufficient ecosystem with two healthy, resilient children at its heart. The story of the boy who turned a grave into a garden spread like wildfire, a modern folktale of defiance and ingenuity. The community of Asheville, moved by his plight and his incredible spirit, wrapped its arms around him and his sister. Offers of help poured in, but the one that mattered most came from Robert and Susan Miller, a retired farming couple who saw in Ethan not a victim to be pitied, but a young man of incredible strength and knowledge. They didn't just offer him a home, they offered him a partnership. 3 years later, the world is a different place. 14-year-old Ethan and 6-year-old Claire live with the Millers on a sprawling farm nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a home filled with warmth, laughter, and the security they had never known. The ravine, however, remains theirs. It is now a legitimate, thriving business called Carter's Canyon, co-managed by Ethan and the Millers, supplying gourmet mushrooms and herbs to Asheville's finest restaurants. It is a symbol of his past and the engine of his future, a place he returns to, not with fear, but with a quiet sense of ownership and peace. He is learning about crop rotation and soil science from Robert, his father's practical lessons now augmented by formal knowledge, his future as vast and fertile as the land around him. As for Raymond Blackwell, his empire built on the backs of broken men crumbled into dust. A class-action lawsuit, filed by the very workers he had exploited for decades, brought his reign of cruelty to an end. 2 years ago, he declared bankruptcy, his vast tobacco farm seized and auctioned off piece by piece. In a final perfect stroke of irony, the only piece of land still bearing his name, the only section that generates a profit, is the worthless ravine he had gifted to a grieving boy as a joke. It stands as a quiet, green testament to the truth that what one man discards in his cruelty, another can cultivate into a source of life, hope, and improbable victory. Ethan often stands at the edge of the ravine, not looking down into the shadows of the past, but across at the mountains, his sister's small hand held firmly in his. He still carries the small wooden bird in his pocket, its surface now worn smooth by his own touch. He understands now that his father did not fail. He had planted a seed in his son, a seed of resilience and knowledge, and it had taken root in the darkest of places. He had given him the tools to turn a curse into a blessing, to grow a future out of a grave. And as he watches Claire chase a butterfly near the entrance to their thriving canyon, he feels the full, profound weight of his father's final words. He was, and always would be,